Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. My name is Lisa, and I'm a park ranger. What I'm about to tell you happened to me not too long ago while I was working in a remote corner of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington. If you've ever been to a place that feels like it's untouched by time, you'll know what I mean. My days usually consist of maintaining trails, helping lost hikers, and occasionally dealing with the odd bear or mountain lion. But what happened that week was different. Something that still haunts me. I've been a park ranger for over 10 years now. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, always loved the outdoors. Never thought I'd end up dealing with something straight out of a nightmare. But life's funny like that. Sometimes it throws you a curveball you can't dodge. One sunny afternoon I was out patrolling a less traveled trail called Misty Ridge. The place is beautiful, but it's a tough hike. Not many people venture out there. It was supposed to be a routine check, just to make sure the path was clear, no fallen trees or washouts. I had my radio, a first aid kit, and a good pair of hiking boots. That's all you really need, or so I thought. I remember it was around midday when I found the first sign that something was off. There was this awful smell, like something had died. Now, in the forest, that's not too uncommon. Deer, raccoons, sometimes even larger animals. Nature has a way of taking care of its own, but this smell was different, stronger, more pungent. It was enough to make me cover my nose with my shirt. As I moved closer, I found the source, a deer carcass. But it wasn't like any I'd seen before. It was torn apart, almost like something had shredded it, not eaten, just destroyed. There were no bite marks that I could identify, and I've seen my fair share. Whatever did this wasn't looking for a meal. I radioed back to the ranger station, let them know what I'd found. Barry, my supervisor, told me to keep an eye out, but didn't seem too concerned. Probably a bear, he said. Just be careful. Easy for him to say, sitting safe in the station. I continued my patrol, but that uneasy feeling stuck with me. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no rustling in the underbrush. Just an eerie silence that set my nerves on edge. By late afternoon, I decided to head back. There was no point in sticking around if there was a bear or something worse in the area. The hike back was uneventful until I reached a clearing about a mile from the ranger station. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was another hiker, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet. With long limbs and a hunched posture. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with an unnatural grace. It didn't see me, or at least it didn't seem to. It was just standing there, staring off into the trees. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Should I call out? Run? My mind was racing. Before I could decide, it turned and looked right at me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark and empty. There was no life in them, just an endless void. It took a step towards me, and that's when I ran. I sprinted through the forest, not caring about the branches that whipped my face or the rocks that tripped me up. I could hear it behind me, moving fast, too fast. I made it back to the station in record time, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Barry was there, and he took one look at me and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked. But I couldn't get the words out. My heart was pounding, my lungs burning. I just shook my head and pointed to the window. He looked out, but there was nothing there. The thing had disappeared. We stayed inside the station for the rest of the day, and I told Barry everything. He didn't believe me, of course. Thought I was just spooked by the deer carcass and my imagination had done the rest. But I knew what I saw, and I knew it was real. The next morning we went back to the clearing, but there was no sign of the creature. No tracks, no evidence that it had ever been there. Barry was convinced it was a bear or maybe even a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. A few days later, another ranger, Jordan, went missing. She was out on a solo patrol, and she never came back. We organized a search party, combed the forest for days, but we found nothing, no clues, no tracks, no body. It was like she had just vanished. The mood at the station changed after that. Everyone was on edge, looking over their shoulders. I started carrying a rifle, even though Barry said it was unnecessary. "We're rangers, not hunters," he'd say, but I wasn't taking any chances. One evening I was sitting in the station cleaning my rifle when the radio crackled to life. It was static at first, but then I heard Jordan's voice, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. "Help me," she said. "It's coming." I grabbed the radio, tried to respond, but there was only static. I looked at Barry, and he was pale as a sheet. "We need to find her," I said, but he just shook his head. "It's too dangerous," he replied. "We need to wait for backup." "By then, it might be too late," I shouted. But he wouldn't budge, so I decided to go alone. I packed my gear, grabbed my rifle, and headed out into the night. The forest was pitch black, the air heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only light came from my flashlight. I followed the trail towards Misty Ridge, hoping to find some sign of Jordan. I walked for what felt like hours, calling her name, but there was no response, just that same eerie silence. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a faint cry for help. I followed the sound, moving as quietly as I could. That's when I saw it again. The creature was standing over Jordan, who was lying on the ground, barely conscious. I raised my rifle, took aim, and fired. The creature let out a sound that I can't even describe, a mix between a screech and a howl. It turned and ran, disappearing into the trees. I rushed to Jordan's side, but she was in bad shape, cuts and bruises all over, and she was barely breathing. I radioed for help, and Barry and a few others arrived within minutes. We carried Jordan back to the station and called for an airlift. She survived, but she never talked about what happened. Not to me, not to anyone. She left the job soon after and moved away. As for the creature, we never saw it again. I told my story to the authorities, but they chalked it up to stress and exhaustion, said I was hallucinating, that there's no such thing as monsters. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there somewhere in the forest. Life went on, and things returned to normal, or as normal as they could be after something like that. But I never went back to Misty Ridge alone, and every now and then, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still smell that awful stench. Some nights I dream about it, the creature, those dark, empty eyes. I wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and I know that whatever it was is still out there, But life has a way of moving forward, even when the past tries to drag you back. I still work as a park ranger, though I've transferred to a different part of the forest. I keep my experiences to myself mostly. People don't like to hear about the things that go bump in the night when they're trying to enjoy a peaceful hike. Every now and then I run into Jordan. She's doing better now, living in the city and working a desk job. We don't talk about that night, but there's an understanding between us, a shared secret that binds us together. We don't need to speak of it to know it's real. Barry retired a year after the incident. He never admitted to believing my story, but he didn't dismiss it either. Just said he was too old for this kind of stress. Can't say I blame him. The forest is a beautiful place, but it has its dark corners. One evening, while sitting on my porch with a beer in hand, I got a call from a young ranger named Flynn. He had just started working in the area I used to patrol. He sounded shaken, talking about a strange carcass he found near Misty Ridge. I felt a chill run down my spine, but tried to keep my voice steady. "Just be careful, Flynn," I said, "and don't go out there alone." He laughed nervously, probably thinking I was just an old ranger telling tall tales, but he promised to keep an eye out. I hung up, feeling a mixture of worry and resignation. The forest keeps its secrets well, and sometimes it's best not to pry. I still go hiking, still love the outdoors, but I'm more cautious now, more aware of the things that move in the shadows. I always carry my rifle, a habit I can't seem to break. Friends laugh, call me paranoid, but I don't mind. Better to be safe than sorry. Years have passed, and I've had time to reflect on what happened. Some nights, when the wind whispers through the trees, I think about that creature, what it was, where it came from, and if it's still out there. I've read about similar encounters, stories from other rangers and hikers, but nothing quite matches what I saw. It's funny, in a way. People spend their lives looking for the extraordinary, the unexplained. But when you come face to face with it, all you want is for things to go back to normal, to pretend it was all just a bad dream. But dreams don't leave scars, and they don't leave you with a sense of unease that never quite fades. I'm more than just a park ranger now. I'm a guardian of sorts, watching over the trails and the people who walk them. I can't protect everyone, and I know that, but I do my best to keep the forest safe, to keep the darkness at bay. It's all anyone can do, really. The world is a strange place, full of mysteries and wonders. Some of them are beautiful, others are terrifying, and sometimes they're both. The key is to keep moving forward, to face the unknown with a steady heart and a clear mind, to be prepared for whatever comes next, even if you don't know what it is. So if you ever find yourself hiking in the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, take a moment to appreciate the beauty around you, but also keep your wits about you. The forest is alive, and it watches, and sometimes, just sometimes, it lets you see what lies beneath the surface. And if you smell something foul, something that turns your stomach, don't ignore it. Trust your instincts and get out of there. The forest may be beautiful, but it has its dark corners, and in those corners the shadows have teeth. My name is Richard, and this happened to me back in 1998. I was living in a small town called Marble, Colorado, surrounded by rugged mountains and dense forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a slower pace. I worked as a mechanic at a local garage, fixing up old trucks and Jeeps, a job I'd loved since I was a kid. My weekends were usually spent hiking or fishing, enjoying the peace and quiet of the wilderness. One Friday night, my friend Lars Rodriguez and I decided to go camping. Lars was a big guy with a laugh that could shake the trees. He worked as a park ranger and knew the area better than anyone. We loaded up his old Bronco with gear, grabbed some beers, and headed out to a spot he knew deep in the mountains. It was a place we'd been to a few times before, far from any trails, where we could relax and forget about the world for a while. We arrived just before dusk, set up camp, and started a fire. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The night was clear, and the stars were brighter than I had ever seen. We cooked up some steaks, drank a few beers, and talked about everything and nothing. Lars was telling me about a weird incident at the park. A couple of hikers had gone missing a few weeks back. They'd found their camp, but the hikers were gone without a trace. It was unsettling, but we shrugged it off. People got lost all the time. As the night wore on, we got more comfortable, the fire crackling and popping. Lars decided to turn in early, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the quiet of the forest. I sat there, staring into the flames, feeling a strange sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I chalked it up to the missing hiker story and the few beers I'd had. Eventually, I doused the fire and crawled into my tent. I woke up sometime later to a strange noise outside. It was a rustling sound, like something moving through the brush. I figured it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But the noise didn't stop. It got closer, more deliberate. I sat up and listened, my heart pounding in my chest. Lars was snoring softly in his tent next to mine, oblivious to the noise. I unzipped my tent quietly and peeked outside. The moon was high, casting an eerie light over the campsite. I didn't see anything at first, just shadows and shapes that didn't make sense. Then I saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing just beyond the fire pit. It was humanoid, but not quite human. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. It looked like it was searching for something. I froze, my mind racing. What the hell was that? I wanted to call out to Lars, but I was paralyzed with fear. The figure turned its head, and I swear it looked right at me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were dark and empty. I scrambled back into my tent, my hands shaking. I fumbled for my flashlight and my hunting knife, my only means of defense. The rustling grew louder, closer. I heard Lars stir in his tent, then a muffled curse as he woke up. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice shaky. I didn't answer. I was too scared to move, to make a sound. The figure was right outside my tent now, its shadow looming over me. I held my breath, clutching the knife tightly, praying it would go away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the noise stopped. The figure was gone. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing happened. Eventually, I heard Lars unzip his tent and step out. I followed, my legs trembling. The campsite was empty, silent. Lars looked as scared as I felt. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I shook my head, unable to speak. We stood there for a while, listening to the silence, until the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains. We decided to pack up and leave. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute in that place. On the drive back, we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Lars suggested it might have been a trick of the light, or maybe a prank by some other campers. But deep down, we both knew it was something else, something we couldn't explain. We didn't talk about it again, not even to each other. A few days later, Lars called me. He sounded more serious than I'd ever heard him. He told me another hiker had gone missing, this time in the area where we camped. The search teams found his gear, but no sign of him. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. Whatever we'd seen that night, it was real. And it was dangerous. Weeks went by, and life went back to normal, or as normal as it could be. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I went into the woods, I felt eyes on me, like something was following me. I started carrying my knife everywhere, even in town. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't help it. Then one evening, I was closing up the garage when Lars came in. He looked exhausted, his eyes bloodshot. He told me he'd been out in the mountains, searching for clues about the missing hikers. He'd found something he needed to show me. I locked up, and we drove out to his place in silence. In his living room, he spread out a map of the area. He pointed to the spot where we camped, then traced a line through the forest. "I found this trail," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's not on any map. It leads to an old cabin, abandoned for years. But there's something else there, something I can't explain." He pulled out a small box and opened it. Inside were scraps of cloth, bits of metal, and a few photographs. The photos were old, black and white, showing a family standing in front of the cabin. There was something off about them, something unsettling. The people in the photos looked almost normal, but not quite. Their eyes were too dark, their smiles too wide. "I think this is where it's coming from," Lars said, his voice trembling. "I think that thing we saw is connected to this place. We need to go back and find out what's going on." I wanted to say no, to forget about the whole thing, but I knew he was right. We had to face whatever it was, or it would keep coming for us. We spent the next few days preparing, gathering supplies, and making sure we were ready for anything. I borrowed a rifle from a friend, and Lars brought his service revolver. We were as ready as we'd ever be. The drive back to the campsite was tense, both of us lost in our thoughts. We hiked to the spot where we'd seen the figure, then followed the trail Lars had found. It was overgrown, barely visible, but it was there. We walked in silence, the forest around us growing darker and more oppressive with each step. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and a strange metallic odor hung heavy in the air. After a few hours, we reached the cabin. It was old, falling apart, and covered in vines. The door hung open, creaking in the wind. We stepped inside, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was stale, filled with the scent of decay. There were old pieces of furniture and rotting floorboards, but no sign of anyone. We split up, searching the cabin for any clues. I found an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. It belonged to the family in the photos. The entries were strange, filled with ramblings about something in the woods, something that watched them. They wrote about hearing noises at night, seeing figures in the trees. It sounded all too familiar. Suddenly I heard a crash from the other room. I ran in to find Lars standing over a broken table, his face pale. He pointed to a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden by the debris. We pried it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into the darkness. We descended slowly, our flashlights barely penetrating the gloom. The basement was cold and damp, with stone walls and a dirt floor. In the corner, we found a makeshift altar covered in strange symbols and old bones. There was a sickly sweet smell in the air, like rotting fruit. Then we heard it, a low, guttural noise from the shadows. We turned, and there it was, the figure we'd seen before. It moved towards us, its limbs too long, its eyes empty. Lars fired his revolver, the shots echoing in the confined space. But bullets didn't seem to affect it. I raised my rifle and fired, hitting it in the chest. It staggered but kept coming. We backed up, trying to make our way to the stairs. Lars stumbled, and the creature was on him in an instant, its long fingers wrapping around his throat. I screamed and fired again, this time aiming for its head. The creature let out a horrible screech and fell to the ground, twitching. I dragged Lars up the stairs, his breathing shallow. We ran from the cabin, not stopping until we reached the Bronco. I drove like a madman, not looking back until we were miles away. Lars was in bad shape, his neck bruised and his eyes wide with shock. We made it to the hospital, and I told them he'd been attacked by a wild animal. Lars survived, but he was never the same. He left Marble not long after, moving to a big city where he could forget about the mountains and the creature. I stayed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The cabin was still out there, and whatever we disturbed was still waiting. I stopped going into the woods alone. I kept my rifle close, always ready for whatever might come. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard that same rustling sound outside my window, like something was searching for me. But I never went back to the cabin. Some things are better left alone. Years later, I heard about more disappearances in the area. Hikers, campers, people who wander too far from the trails. The authorities chalked it up to accidents, but I knew better. Whatever was out there, it was still hungry, still hunting, and I knew one day it would find me. But until then, I'd keep my guard up and my rifle loaded, ready for the next time I heard that rustling in the dark. I never should have taken that detour. I was driving back from a business trip, following the GPS blindly, when I saw the sign for a scenic route. Why not? I thought. I could use a change of scenery from the endless highway. The road wound through dense forests, the trees closing in like an embrace. It was peaceful at first, almost hypnotic. I'm Bernard Ryland, and this is how a peaceful drive turned into the most terrifying experience of my life. The forest was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the road. I was feeling good, windows down, music playing. Then the GPS signal cut out. I wasn't too worried. I'd driven this car enough to trust my instincts. But as the road narrowed and the forest grew thicker, my sense of unease grew. The occasional abandoned house, with its darkened windows and overgrown yards, added to the creepiness. After driving for what felt like hours, I realized I was hopelessly lost. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, but the beauty did little to ease my growing anxiety. The forest, once welcoming, now felt oppressive, the shadows deepening with every passing minute. I hadn't seen another car for miles. I decided to turn around, but the road had twisted and turned so many times, I wasn't even sure where I had come from. My phone still had no signal, and the car's built-in GPS was no help either. I drove on, hoping to find a clearing or a sign, anything that could help me get my bearings. That's when I saw it, an old, decrepit gas station. It looked like it hadn't been operational for years, but there was a light on inside. Desperate for directions, I pulled in and got out of the car. The place reeked of decay and oil, the smell thick in the still air. The sign above the door swung in the breeze, creaking eerily. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The dim light came from a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering occasionally. The shelves were empty, covered in dust. Behind the counter, a man sat staring at me with a blank expression. His clothes were ragged, and his hair hung in greasy strands. "Can I help you?" His voice was gruff, almost a growl. "Yeah, I'm lost. Can you tell me how to get back to the highway?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a long moment before answering. "You're a long way from the highway, friend. Best you stay here for the night. Safer that way." The suggestion sent a shiver down my spine. There was something off about this guy. His eyes never seemed to focus, and he had an unsettling grin that didn't reach them. I thanked him but decided to keep driving. I had a bad feeling about staying there. As I was about to leave, another man walked in, younger, with the same vacant eyes. He looked me up and down, then turned to the older man. "Another one?" he asked. "Yup," the older man replied, not taking his eyes off me. I didn't wait for more. I hurried out, got into my car, and sped off. I didn't care if I was driving deeper into the forest. I just needed to get away from that place. The sun had set completely now, and the darkness was suffocating. My headlights barely penetrated the thick gloom. The road seemed to narrow, the trees pressing in on either side, branches scratching at the car like skeletal fingers trying to grab me. I drove for another hour, maybe more. I lost track of time. The gas gauge was nearing empty, and I hadn't seen another building or person. Just as I was beginning to panic, I saw a light in the distance. I drove towards it, hoping for another gas station or a house. What I found was a large, old mansion, the kind you'd see in horror movies. The place was illuminated by dim lanterns, casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown lawn. I should have driven away, but I was out of options. I pulled up to the gate and honked. After a few moments, a woman appeared, carrying a lantern. She was in her late 40s, with a stern face and hair pulled back tightly. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm and cold. "I'm lost. Can you tell me how to get back to the highway?" I asked again, the desperation clear in my voice. She looked at me for a moment, then nodded. "Come inside. My husband can give you directions." I hesitated, but the alternative was spending the night in my car, alone in the dark woods with an empty gas tank. I decided to follow her. The mansion was old, and the air inside was thick with the smell of damp wood and dust. She led me to a sitting room where a man sat by the fireplace, reading a book. He looked up as we entered. He was older, with gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. "This gentleman is lost," the woman said. He needs directions to the highway. The man put down his book and stood up. Of course, come sit down. Would you like something to drink? I declined, eager to get back on the road. I just need directions, thanks. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. It's no trouble at all. But the roads can be dangerous at night. Why don't you stay here until morning? The offer was tempting, but something about their hospitality felt off, forced. I insisted on leaving, and the man's smile faded. Very well, he said. I'll write down the directions for you. As he wrote, I noticed the walls were lined with old photographs. One, in particular, caught my eye. It was a family portrait, but the faces were scratched out. It sent a chill down my spine. The man handed me the directions, and I thanked him, eager to leave. As I turned to go, the woman grabbed my arm. Be careful, she said, her grip surprisingly strong. There are dangers in these woods. I nodded and hurried out, a sense of foreboding heavy in my gut. As I drove away, I glanced at the directions. They seemed straightforward enough, but the nagging feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave me. I followed the directions carefully, but after an hour, I realized I was back where I started, in front of the mansion. Panic set in. I must have taken a wrong turn. I tried again, but no matter which way I went, I kept ending up back at the mansion. It was like the forest was playing tricks on me. Out of options and low on gas, I decided to go back to the mansion and ask for help again. This time, the man and woman were waiting for me outside. Lost again? The man asked, his tone almost mocking. Yeah, I admitted, feeling foolish. Can I stay here for the night? Of course, the woman said, her smile now unnerving. They showed me to a guest room. It was musty, with old furniture and a bed that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I tried to sleep, but every noise jolted me awake. Around midnight, I heard voices. I crept to the door and listened. The third one this month, the woman whispered. I know, the man replied. We need to be careful. The others are getting suspicious. My blood ran cold. I wasn't the first lost traveler to end up here. I needed to get out. But how? I peeked out of the room and saw them both in the hallway, their backs to me. I slipped out quietly and made my way downstairs. I reached the front door, but it was locked. I searched for another exit and found a back door leading to the garden. As I stepped outside, I heard a noise behind me. The younger man from the gas station was there, a sinister grin on his face. Going somewhere? He asked. I didn't wait to respond. I ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the scratches from the branches. I could hear footsteps behind me, getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled through the darkness. I tripped over something and fell, rolling down a small hill. When I came to a stop, I realized I had landed in a shallow grave. The smell of decay was overwhelming. I scrambled out, terrified, and kept running. Finally, I saw headlights in the distance. A car was coming down the road. I waved frantically, hoping they would see me. The car slowed down, and I ran towards it. Help! Please, help me! I shouted. The car stopped, and a man got out. What's going on? He asked. I was at the mansion up the road. They're after me, I gasped. The man's expression changed to one of understanding. Get in, he said. I didn't hesitate. As we drove away, I explained everything. He listened quietly, then nodded. You're lucky I found you. Not many people come this way. He dropped me off at the nearest town, and I reported everything to the police. They seemed skeptical at first, but when they searched the forest, they found the mansion and the graves. The people from the mansion were arrested, and the whole twisted operation was uncovered. I never found out why they did what they did, or how many victims there were. All I know is that I escaped by sheer luck. I still think about that night sometimes, about the vacant eyes of the men and the woman's unnerving smile. I've learned my lesson about taking detours, that's for sure. Some roads are best left untraveled. My name's Frank Haskins, and I've been a search and rescue officer for the United States Forest Service for over 15 years. It's not an easy job, but it's one I've always felt was worth doing. The endless stretch of wilderness, the towering trees, the rugged mountains, these have been my companions for as long as I can remember. But today, I experienced something that I still can't fully wrap my head around. Something that took a piece of my sanity and left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the forest. The day started like any other. I was assigned to a search for a missing hiker, a young woman named Emily Carter, who had gone missing 3 days ago in the dense woods of the Olympic National Forest. She was supposed to be an experienced hiker, familiar with the terrain, but sometimes the forest has a way of humbling even the most seasoned outdoorsman. I was teamed up with 2 other officers, Dave Morton and Julie Sanchez. We were given a grid to search, a section of the forest known for its dense underbrush and steep inclines. We parked our truck at the trailhead, strapped on our gear, and started the trek into the wilderness. The forest was quiet that morning, an almost eerie silence that was only broken by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. We made our way along the trail, calling out Emily's name, hoping for any sign of her. It wasn't long before we found the first clue, a torn piece of her backpack snagged on a branch. It was a small but significant find that spurred us on with renewed vigor. As the day wore on, the forest seemed to close in around us. The underbrush grew thicker, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the trees seemed to loom larger, casting long shadows that danced and twisted on the forest floor. We continued to call out, our voices echoing in the stillness, but there was no answer, no sign of Emily. Then, just as the sun was beginning its descent, we found something that made our blood run cold. In a small clearing, partially obscured by bushes, we found a campsite. The tent was shredded, its fabric hanging in tatters. The ground was littered with scattered belongings, clothes, food wrappers, a flashlight. But the most disturbing sight was the blood. It was everywhere, staining the ground, splattered on the trees. There were deep gashes in the earth as if something had been dragged away. Julie knelt by the remains of the tent, examining the ground. "Looks like a struggle," she said, her voice steady but tense. "Whatever happened here, it wasn't pretty." Dave nodded, his face grim. "We need to call this in, get a forensic team out here." I agreed, but something about the scene bothered me. It wasn't just the blood or the destruction, it was the feeling of being watched. I scanned the surrounding trees, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone. We set up a temporary camp a few yards away from the scene and radioed for backup. As we waited, the forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening until they seemed to swallow the light. We built a fire, the flickering flames providing a small circle of comfort in the encroaching darkness. The forensic team arrived just as night fell, a group of 6 men and women led by Dr. Amanda Keller, a no-nonsense woman with years of experience in crime scene investigation. They immediately set to work, photographing the scene, collecting samples, and combing the area for any clues. As the night wore on, we kept a weary eye on the forest. The feeling of being watched had not abated. If anything, it had grown stronger. It was as if the forest itself was alive, and it didn't like our presence. Around midnight, as the forensic team was wrapping up, we heard a low, guttural noise that seemed to come from all around us. It was unlike anything I had ever heard, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my chest and send chills down my spine. We all froze, our eyes darting to the darkness beyond the firelight. "What the hell was that?" Dave whispered, his hand going to the pistol at his side. "I don't know," I replied, my own hand gripping the hilt of my knife. "But I don't think we're alone out here." The noise came again, closer this time. It was followed by the sound of something moving through the underbrush, the rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs. We strained our eyes, trying to see what was out there. But the darkness was impenetrable. Suddenly, one of the forensic team members, a young woman named Sarah, screamed. She had been examining a blood-stained piece of cloth near the edge of the clearing when something had grabbed her leg. We rushed to her aid, but she was gone, dragged into the darkness so quickly we could barely register what had happened. "Sarah!" Dr. Keller shouted, her voice filled with panic. "Where is she? What took her?" We spread out, our flashlights cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of Sarah. The only evidence of her presence was a deep gouge in the earth where she had been standing, and a trail of blood leading into the trees. "We need to get out of here," Julie said, her voice trembling. "Whatever that thing is, it's hunting us." Dave and I nodded in agreement. We gathered the remaining members of the forensic team and made our way back to the trailhead as quickly as we could. The journey back was a nightmare. The forest, once so familiar, had become a place of terror. Every rustle, every snap of a twig sent us into a panic. We moved as quickly as we could, but it felt like the forest was conspiring against us, slowing our progress, leading us astray. Then, just as we thought we were in the clear, it struck again. This time it was Dave who was taken. One moment he was beside me, the next he was gone, dragged screaming into the darkness. We fired our weapons blindly into the trees, but it was no use. Whatever was out there was too fast, too powerful. Julie and I ran. We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. We radioed for help, our voices filled with fear and desperation. We could hear the creature behind us, its guttural noises growing louder, closer. When the rescue team arrived, they found us huddled by the truck, our faces pale, our bodies trembling. They didn't believe us at first, thought we were delirious from the stress and fear. But then they saw the blood, the torn pieces of clothing, the deep gouges in the earth. A search party was sent out, heavily armed and on high alert. They combed the forest, but they found no trace of the creature, no sign of Dave or Sarah. They found Emily's body, or what was left of it, in a shallow grave not far from the campsite. Her body was mangled, torn apart by something with incredible strength. The official report said she had been attacked by a wild animal, likely a bear. But I knew better. There was something in that forest. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that had taken my friends and left me with a deep, gnawing fear that I would never be able to shake. I left the Forest Service not long after that. I couldn't bring myself to go back into the woods, not after what had happened. I moved to the city, took a job in an office, trying to forget the horrors I had witnessed. But every night, I would hear that guttural noise in my dreams, and I knew that whatever it was still out there. I never told anyone the full story. The official report was enough for most people, but I knew the truth. And sometimes late at night, when the city is quiet, I can still hear that noise, and I wonder if it's coming for me next. The Marion Ridge Monster. My name is Cal Ricks, and I've been a cop in Marion Ridge, Tennessee for the better part of a decade. It's a quiet place, nestled in the Smoky Mountains, where the biggest crime I usually deal with is some teenager trying to sneak a six-pack out of the local gas station. But yesterday was different. I'm not sure if anyone will believe me, but I know what happened, and I have the proof to back it up. The day started like any other. I was running late, grabbing my coffee from the diner, when dispatch called in about a missing person report from the outskirts of town. No one gets lost out here, not really. The forest is thick, sure, but the locals know it well enough to navigate blindfolded. This report, though, was different. A man, Aaron Wild, had been out hunting and hadn't returned by sundown the previous night. His wife was frantic, saying he never stayed out past dark, especially not with a storm like the one that had rolled in. I downed the rest of my coffee, tossed a few bucks on the counter, and headed to the station. I grabbed my partner, Scott Hendricks, who's been with me since I joined the force. We've seen some things together: domestic disputes, bar fights, the occasional bear causing a ruckus in someone's yard, but nothing that could have prepared us for what was coming. We drove out to the Wild place, a small cabin on the edge of the woods. The road there was muddy from the rain, and the trees, heavy with moisture, seemed to be pressing in closer than usual. Mrs. Wild met us at the door, her face pale, hands shaking. She was a sturdy woman, not the type to scare easy, but there was a fear in her eyes that set me on edge. "He didn't come back," she said, her voice trembling. "Aaron's never done this before." We assured her we'd find him, probably just got caught up tracking something, lost track of time. She nodded, but I could see she didn't believe it. Neither did I, not really. Something felt off. We headed into the woods where Aaron had been last seen. The trees were thick, the kind that block out most of the sunlight, leaving the ground covered in a bed of damp leaves and fallen branches. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and pine needles, but beneath that, there was another smell, faint but foul, like something rotting. We walked in silence, the only sounds the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional bird overhead. "Cal, you notice something?" Scott said after we'd been walking a while. "What's that?" "No birds, no animals. It's quiet, too quiet." He was right. The usual sounds of the forest were gone, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to grow thicker the further we went. We found Aaron's camp a few hours in. His rifle was leaning against a tree, untouched, but there was no sign of him. The fire pit was cold, hadn't been used recently. We started searching the area, calling his name, but the only thing that answered was the wind rustling through the trees. Then we found the blood, a trail of it leading deeper into the forest. It wasn't much at first, just a few drops, but it quickly turned into a dark, thick line that made my stomach turn. We followed it, both of us quiet now, the tension growing with every step. The trail led us to a small clearing. At first, it looked empty, just more trees and rocks. But then I saw it, something large, hunched over in the middle of the clearing, covered in blood. It wasn't an animal I recognized, not any kind I'd ever seen in these woods. Its body was twisted, almost humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its skin pale and covered in patches of fur that looked like they had been torn out in chunks. It was eating something that looked like it had once been human. Jesus Christ, Scott whispered, his voice barely audible. The thing's head snapped up, its eyes dark voids devoid of any light, locked onto us. For a moment, no one moved. Then it let out a noise that made my blood run cold, a sound that was almost a growl, but deeper, more guttural. The smell hit us next, rotten, like something that had been dead for days. It lunged at us, moving faster than anything that size should be able to. Scott and I fired our guns, hitting it several times, but it didn't slow down. It knocked Scott to the ground, its claws tearing into him before I could even react. I kept shooting, emptying my clip into its back until it finally collapsed. Scott was screaming, his leg torn open, blood pouring out onto the forest floor. I didn't have time to think. I grabbed a rock, the first thing I could find, and brought it down on the creature's head, again and again, until it stopped moving. I don't know how long I sat there, covered in blood, staring at the thing that had just tried to kill us. It didn't vanish, didn't fade away into the woods. It just lay there, a twisted, broken body that was too real to be anything but a nightmare made flesh. Scott was unconscious by the time I got him back to the car. I drove as fast as I could to the hospital, my hands still shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. They patched him up, said he'd be okay, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe what I told them, not really. Who would? I went back the next day with a few other officers. The body was still there, right where I'd left it. It hadn't decomposed, hadn't been touched by scavengers. We bagged it, took it back to the station, but no one could tell me what it was. Not the coroner, not the biologists we brought in. All they could say was that it wasn't human, but it wasn't any animal they recognized either. Aaron Wild's body was found a few miles away, or what was left of it, torn apart, barely recognizable. We buried him yesterday. His wife didn't say much during the service, just stared at the ground, her face pale. They believe me now. They have to. We've got the body, the evidence, everything. But I still can't shake the feeling that this isn't over, that there's something else out there in those woods, something we've disturbed. I don't know if it's alone, and I don't know if it's coming back. But I'm ready. The silence of Kings Park. The first thing you notice about life in Kings Park is the sense of quiet that blankets the place. It's the kind of quiet that makes you wonder if you've gone deaf, or if the world decided to take a break from all its usual noise. My name is Ree Eldridge, and I'm the park ranger here. After years of dealing with city chaos, I welcomed the peace of the forest. But today is about to change all that. Kings Park is nestled in the heart of Washington, covering 1,000 acres of dense woodland, meandering streams, and some of the oldest trees in the state. It's beautiful and eerie, all at once. We've got our share of wildlife, from deer to black bears, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until recently, visitors have been reporting strange sounds and shadows darting through the trees, but we've brushed it off as nothing but their imaginations running wild, I guess. No one wants to believe in monsters until they're staring one in the face. I started my day with the usual routine, checking the trails, ensuring the campsites were clean, and logging any notable changes in the park's ecosystem. Around noon, I got a call from Leslie, a fellow ranger, about a hiker who'd gone missing. We get missing hiker reports now and then, but they're usually resolved within a few hours. I didn't expect today to be any different. Leslie and I met up near the southern edge of the park, where the hiker, a man named Dr. Ivan Sosi, was last seen. Dr. Sosi was an entomologist studying the park's insect population. He was known for his meticulous nature and his habit of venturing into less traveled areas, making his exact location a bit of a mystery. We started our search, following the trail he'd likely taken, calling his name as we went. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and the only sounds were our own footsteps and the occasional bird call. An hour passed with no sign of him. We found his camp, but it was eerily abandoned, his tent untouched, gear scattered around. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. The only oddity was a series of deep scratches on a nearby tree, too high for any animal I knew. As the sun began to set, the park's usual tranquility took on a more sinister feel. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle of leaves seemed amplified. Leslie suggested we head back and regroup in the morning, but I had a nagging feeling we were running out of time. Just as we were about to turn back, we heard a scream, a sound that ripped through the quiet and made my blood run cold. It came from deeper in the woods, where the trees grew denser and the underbrush thicker. We broke into a run, the scream guiding us, until it abruptly stopped. That silence was more terrifying than the scream itself. We found Dr. Sosi, or what was left of him. His body was mangled, torn apart in a way that no bear or mountain lion could manage. It was gruesome, the kind of sight that haunts you. Leslie vomited. I just stood there, numb and disbelieving. The sheer brutality of the attack defied explanation. As we stood there trying to process what we were seeing, a low rustling came from the trees around us. At first, it was just a faint noise, like the wind through the leaves, but it grew louder, more deliberate. We weren't alone. Out of the shadows emerged a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall, almost 7 feet, with a gaunt, skeletal frame covered in matted, dark fur. Its limbs were too long, fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. But the most unsettling part was its face, or lack thereof. It was a featureless void, just a blank expanse of flesh where eyes and a mouth should be. Leslie and I backed away slowly, but the creature moved faster than seemed possible, cutting off our retreat. It let out a sound that was half screech, half growl, a noise that vibrated in my chest and sent a primal fear coursing through me. We bolted, the creature hot on our heels. Branches whipped at our faces as we tore through the forest. Leslie tripped, and I had to drag her up, the creature gaining on us. We burst into a small clearing where our radio signal was finally strong enough to call for backup. I grabbed the mic and shouted for help, giving our coordinates in a frantic rush. Seconds felt like hours as we waited. The creature circled us, its movements unnaturally fluid, like a predator toying with its prey. Just when I thought it was going to lunge, headlights broke through the trees. A team of rangers, armed and ready, jumped out and opened fire on the creature. The bullets didn't stop it, but they slowed it down enough for us to make a break for the trucks. We sped out of there, the creature's silhouette disappearing into the darkness. Back at the ranger station, we tried to make sense of what happened, but there were no easy answers. The authorities arrived, took our statements, and cordoned off the area. They found Dr. Sosi's remains, but no trace of the creature. Officially, it was labeled as an animal attack, though we knew better. We were advised not to speak of the creature to avoid panic, but the memory of it would never fade. The park remained open, but with increased patrols and more warnings to visitors. The strange sounds and sightings continued, though no one else went missing, at least not yet. I still work there, patrolling the trails, keeping an eye out for anything unusual. The quiet of Kings Park is no longer comforting. It's a reminder of the things that lurk just out of sight, waiting. My name is Eugene Rathbone, and I'm a park ranger stationed in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. I've been working here for about 6 years now. I grew up in a small town nearby, so the mountains are in my blood. I know these trails like the back of my hand, and I've seen all kinds of wildlife and weather. But what happened last year still haunts me. It was late fall, and the leaves had turned a brilliant mix of reds and oranges. The tourists were thinning out, and the park was quieter, which I usually liked. The crisp air was filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional bird call. I was out on a routine patrol, making sure everything was in order before the winter snows began to set in. My buddy, Rick Petrie, was with me. Rick's been my partner for 3 years, and we always have a good time, swapping stories and keeping an eye on the park. "Hey Gene, you hear about that old legend of the wood crawler?" Rick asked, grinning. "Come on, man, not this again," I laughed. "It's just a bunch of nonsense." "Yeah, but it keeps the campers on their toes," he chuckled. The legend of the wood crawler was an old one, told by the locals to spook tourists. It was supposed to be some kind of humanoid creature that stalked the woods at night. I'd never seen anything to make me believe it was real, but every year a few campers would swear they saw something. We were about 2 miles from the ranger station when we got a call on the radio. A couple of hikers had gone missing. Their friends reported them overdue by several hours, which wasn't entirely unusual, but always worth checking out. "We better go have a look," Rick said, turning serious. We headed toward the last known location of the hikers, a remote part of the park where the trails get a bit tricky. As we approached, the sky started to darken with an incoming storm. We picked up the pace, not wanting to get caught in the rain. After about an hour of searching, we found one of the hikers, a young woman named Emily. She was huddled under a tree, shivering and terrified. When she saw us, she burst into tears. "Thank God you're here," she cried. "My boyfriend Jason, he's still out there. Something attacked us." "Attacked you? By what?" I asked, trying to keep her calm. "I don't know," she sobbed. "It was big, and it moved so fast. Jason tried to fight it off so I could run. Rick and I exchanged a glance. This wasn't sounding like a bear or any other wildlife we knew. "All right, Emily, you're safe now. Can you show us where you last saw Jason?" I asked. She nodded and led us deeper into the woods, her steps faltering as the rain began to fall. The light was fading fast, and the storm was making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We reached a small clearing where we found signs of a struggle. There were broken branches, scuffed dirt, and worst of all, blood. Rick and I split up to search the area, calling out for Jason. I could hear the wind whipping through the trees, making it hard to distinguish any other sounds. After what felt like an eternity, I heard Rick shout, "Gene, over here." I ran towards his voice and found him standing over Jason's body. He was alive, but barely. He had deep gashes across his chest and arms, and his eyes were wide with terror. "We need to get him back to the station," I said, trying to lift him. But Jason was in shock, mumbling incoherently about the creature and it's coming back. We managed to get Jason onto a makeshift stretcher and started the long trek back to the station. The storm was raging by now, with thunder rumbling overhead and lightning illuminating the dark forest. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something moving in the shadows. We finally made it back to the ranger station and called for medical assistance. Emily stayed with Jason, holding his hand and trying to keep him calm. Rick and I stepped outside, both of us shaking. "What the hell do you think did that?" Rick asked, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "I don't know," I replied, "but whatever it is, it's not normal. We need to report this and get some backup out here." The next day, a search team was dispatched to comb the area where we found Jason. Rick and I went back out with them, determined to find answers. The forest felt different, more ominous. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig put me on edge. We spent hours searching but found nothing conclusive. The only thing out of the ordinary was a series of strange tracks, almost like large human footprints, but with elongated toes. The search team was baffled, and the locals started whispering about the wood crawler again. Over the next few weeks, more people went missing. Campers, hikers, even a couple of seasoned hunters. Each disappearance was more mysterious than the last, with no clear signs of what happened to them. The park was officially closed to the public, but Rick and I continued our patrols, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. One night, while on a solo patrol, I heard something. It was a low, guttural noise, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. I froze, my flashlight sweeping across the trees. The noise came again, closer this time. I turned and saw it, a tall, gaunt figure with pale skin and glowing eyes. It was watching me from the shadows, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. I raised my gun, my hand shaking. The creature didn't move, just stared at me with those haunting eyes. I backed away slowly, keeping my gun trained on it. As soon as I was out of sight, I ran back to the station, my heart pounding. Rick was there when I burst in, out of breath and terrified. "I saw it, Rick. The wood crawler. It's real," I gasped. He looked at me, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, Gene. This place isn't safe anymore." We reported what I saw to our superiors, but they were skeptical. The disappearances were officially blamed on wild animals or unfortunate accidents. But I knew the truth. Something was out there. something dangerous. Rick and I decided to stick together for our patrols from then on. We were determined to find proof of the creature's existence, to protect the park and the people who visited it. But the wood crawler was elusive, always one step ahead of us. One evening, as we were preparing to head out, we got a call about another missing person, a solo hiker last seen near the old fire tower. We geared up and set off, our nerves on edge. The sun was setting as we reached the fire tower, casting long shadows across the forest. We found the hiker's backpack near the base of the tower, but there was no sign of the man himself. As we searched, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence settled over the woods. "Gene, look at this," Rick said, pointing to a tree. There were deep claw marks gouged into the bark, too large to be from any known animal. Before I could respond, we heard a scream, a blood-curdling, desperate scream that echoed through the trees. We ran towards the sound, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We found the hiker lying on the ground, his leg badly injured. He was babbling incoherently, his eyes wide with fear. "It got me! It got me!" he cried. "We're here now, you're safe," I said, trying to calm him down. But I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. We weren't alone. Rick and I got the hiker to his feet and started making our way back to the station. The forest seemed to close in around us, every shadow and sound putting us on edge. Then, without warning, the wood crawler appeared in front of us, blocking our path. It was even more terrifying up close, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It let out a chilling sound, and I felt a cold dread wash over me. Rick fired his gun, but the creature moved with impossible speed, dodging the bullets. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing the hiker and pulling him along. Rick was right behind us, reloading his gun as we ran. We could hear the creature pursuing us, its movements unnaturally fast and silent. We stumbled through the trees, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Just when I thought we might make it, Rick tripped and fell. "Go, get him to safety," he yelled, struggling to get back up. I hesitated for a moment, torn between helping my friend and protecting the injured hiker. But I knew Rick would never forgive me if I let the hiker die. I pushed forward, dragging the hiker with me. We reached the ranger station and slammed the door shut, locking it behind us. I grabbed the radio and called for backup, my hands shaking. "Rick's still out there! We need help now!" I shouted. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for the backup to arrive. The hiker was in shock, and I did my best to keep him calm. My mind was racing, thinking about Rick and hoping he was okay. When the backup finally arrived, we headed back out into the woods, determined to find Rick. We combed the area around the fire tower, calling out his name. The rain had started again, making it even harder to see and hear. After what felt like an eternity, we found him. Rick was lying on the ground, barely conscious, with deep wounds across his chest and arms. He'd put up one hell of a fight. "We need to get him to a hospital," I said, my voice shaking. We got Rick back to the station and into the waiting ambulance. I rode with him, holding his hand and praying he would pull through. Rick survived, but just barely. He spent weeks in the hospital recovering from his injuries. The hiker we saved was luckier, only needing a few stitches and a lot of therapy to deal with the trauma. The park was officially closed after that, the disappearances and attacks finally taken seriously. The legend of the wood crawler spread like wildfire, with everyone having their own theories about what it was and where it came from. Some said it was a creature from Native American folklore. Others believed it was a government experiment gone wrong, but no one knew for sure. As for me, I couldn't bring myself to leave the park. It was my home, and despite the danger, I felt a duty to protect it. Rick eventually moved away, unable to face the memories of what happened. We still keep in touch, though, sharing stories and trying to make sense of that night. The wood crawler was never caught or seen again, but the fear it left behind remained. Every time I hear a strange noise or see a shadow moving in the woods, I can't help but think about it. The legend lives on, and so does the mystery. And that's my story. Just another day in the life of a park ranger, right? But I wouldn't trade it for anything. The mountains are my home, and I'll keep protecting them, no matter what lurks in the shadows. My name is Ellis Cromwell, and I work as a park ranger in a place that most folks have never heard of, Pinery Woods, somewhere tucked in the northern stretches of Michigan. I'm not the type you'd expect to find living out here in the boonies. Grew up in Detroit, played football in high school, and even dabbled in a bit of computer science in college before deciding the city life wasn't for me. Too much noise, too many people. Pinery Woods offered something different: peace, quiet, and a job where I could roam the woods and breathe fresh air. My job mostly involves making sure hikers don't get lost and chasing off the occasional bear, not that we see many of those. I've got a good sense of humor about it. You'd be surprised how many people think the woods are out to get them. Sometimes it's like babysitting, but I enjoy it. I mean, it's hard to complain when your office is a forest. One day, early in October, I was working the late shift. It's the time of year when the days get shorter, and the woods start to feel a little different. The trees, with their leaves turning red and gold, cast long shadows in the afternoon light. It's beautiful, really, but it can also play tricks on your mind if you're not used to it. My friend and colleague Jimmy Talbot was with me that day. He's a good guy, always cracking jokes, trying to make the job more fun. "Hey, Ellis," Jimmy said, nudging me with his elbow as we walked along one of the lesser-known trails. "Ever get the feeling these woods are hiding something?" "Like what?" I chuckled. "Bigfoot? Ghosts?" "Nah," he said, shaking his head. "Just something. Can't put my finger on it." "Maybe it's your imagination," I replied. "You've been watching too many horror movies." We laughed it off, but there was a part of me that understood what he meant. The woods can feel alive sometimes, like they're watching you as much as you're watching them. We kept walking, our boots crunching on the fallen leaves, the sound of birds and the rustling of the trees our only companions. That's when we found the campsite. It wasn't unusual to stumble upon a makeshift site, but this one was different. It looked abandoned, like whoever had been there left in a hurry. The fire was out, but still warm, and there were clothes scattered around, along with a couple of backpacks. "Hello?" I called out, looking around. "Anyone here?" No answer. Jimmy and I exchanged glances, our earlier lightheartedness fading. "Think we should take a look?" Jimmy asked, already moving towards one of the backpacks. "Yeah, better safe than sorry," I agreed. We split up, checking the area. I picked up one of the backpacks and rummaged through it. Clothes, couple of water bottles, some granola bars, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I found something that made my stomach twist. A journal. It belonged to a guy named Aaron Monroe. His last entry was from 2 days ago and mentioned strange noises at night, something moving outside his tent. "Jimmy, take a look at this," I said, handing him the journal. He read the entry and frowned. "Creepy. Think they just got spooked and left?" "Maybe," I said, though I wasn't convinced. "We should report this and see if we can find them. They could be in trouble." We radioed it in and got a team together to search the area. By the time we finished, the sun was setting, casting the woods in an eerie orange glow. We found no sign of Aaron or anyone else from the campsite. It was like they'd vanished. That night, back at the ranger station, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jimmy tried to lighten the mood by telling jokes, but even he seemed unsettled. We decided to call it a night, hoping things would make more sense in the morning. I was wrong. The next day, we got a call about another missing person. This time a young woman named Clara Davis. She'd been hiking with her dog and was supposed to check in at the station 2 days ago. Her family was worried sick. Jimmy and I were tasked with searching her last known location, which wasn't far from where we found Aaron's campsite. We hiked out there, the woods feeling more oppressive than usual. The trees seemed to close in around us, and every sound was amplified. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves. We found her dog first, a golden retriever named Max, wandering alone and looking scared. No sign of Clara. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling down to pet him. "Where's your owner?" Max whimpered and nudged my hand. I took that as a sign to follow him. He led us deeper into the woods, to a spot that made my blood run cold. There, in a small clearing, we found Clara. She was lying on the ground, her body twisted in an unnatural way, her eyes wide open but lifeless. Jimmy cursed under his breath, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me. This wasn't an accident. Someone or something had done this. "We need to call this in," I said, my voice shaky. "Yeah," Jimmy agreed, already reaching for his radio. As we waited for backup, I couldn't stop thinking about Aaron's journal, the strange noises, the feeling of being watched. It all seemed connected somehow, but how and why? The investigation into Clara's death and Aaron's disappearance ramped up quickly. The police got involved, and the woods were crawling with officers and search teams. Jimmy and I were questioned, of course, but there wasn't much we could tell them. We were just as confused and scared as everyone else. A week went by with no new leads. The police set up a base camp in the woods, and every day they combed through the area, looking for any clue that might explain what happened. I tried to go about my duties, but it was hard to focus. The woods didn't feel like home anymore. They felt like a threat. Then one night I was woken by a loud bang on my cabin door. I grabbed my flashlight and opened it to find Jimmy, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Ellis, you need to come with me." "Now, what's going on?" I asked, pulling on my boots. "There's something out there," he said, his voice trembling. "Something not human." We grabbed our gear and headed into the woods. Jimmy led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. We didn't talk much, just moved quickly and quietly. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what he'd said. Not human? What the hell did that mean? We reached a spot near the edge of the park where the trees were dense and the underbrush thick. Jimmy pointed to a cluster of bushes, and we both crouched down, peering through the leaves. That's when I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, with long limbs and skin that looked pale and stretched, like it didn't quite fit. It moved slowly, almost methodically, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It was dragging something, a body. "Oh my God," I whispered. "What is that?" "I don't know," Jimmy replied. "But it's been killing people, Alice. We need to stop it." My heart pounded in my chest as we watched the creature disappear into the trees. We had to act, but how? We weren't armed, and even if we were, could we take down something like that? "We need to get help," I said. "Call the police." Jimmy nodded, and we started to back away slowly, trying not to make any noise. But then I stepped on a twig, and it snapped loudly in the quiet night. The creature froze and turned its head towards us, its eyes locking onto mine. And for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Jimmy's arm and pulling him with me. We sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at our faces, our breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear the creature behind us, its footsteps heavy and relentless. We reached the ranger station and slammed the door shut, locking it and pushing a heavy desk in front of it for good measure. Jimmy grabbed the radio and called for backup, his voice frantic. "This is Ranger Talbot. We need immediate assistance at the station. There's something out here, something not human." I could hear the dispatcher's confused response, but Jimmy just repeated his plea for help. I looked out the window, my flashlight beam sweeping across the dark woods. I couldn't see the creature, but I knew it was out there watching us. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they were skeptical at first, but the look in our eyes must have convinced them to take us seriously. They searched the area, but found no trace of the creature. The body it had been dragging was gone too. The police set up a more permanent presence in the park after that, and the disappearances and deaths stopped. Jimmy and I never saw the creature again, but the memory of that night haunted us both. We knew what we had seen, and we knew that whatever it was still out there somewhere. I kept working as a ranger, but the woods never felt the same. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for its next chance to strike. Jimmy eventually transferred to another park, unable to deal with the fear and the nightmares. As for me, I stayed. Someone had to. The woods needed watching, and the people who visited them needed protecting, even if that meant facing the darkness head-on every single day. My name is Morgan Dupree, and this all happened to me back in 2019. I was a park ranger at Mount Rainier National Park in Washington. I loved my job. It gave me a sense of purpose. Plus, I got to be outdoors all the time, which was a huge perk. Before working here, I was a teacher for a few years, but I traded the classroom for the forest, thinking I'd find more peace. Boy, was I wrong. It was a typical day, and I was doing my usual patrol around the perimeter of the park. It was just past noon, and the sun was doing its best to peek through the thick canopy. I remember laughing to myself about a joke my buddy Ralph had told me the other day. "Why don't scientists trust atoms?" he'd asked. "Because they make up everything?" Stupid joke, but it got a chuckle out of me anyway. I was just walking along, making sure everything was in order. The forest was quiet, which was normal for that time of day. Birds were chirping, and the wind rustled through the leaves. It was peaceful, but then I noticed something odd. There was a strange silence, like the forest had taken a deep breath and was holding it. I paused and looked around. The path ahead seemed clear, but something felt off. I shrugged it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. I continued walking until I saw something on the ground that made my heart skip a beat. There was a shoe, a single hiking boot, lying there in the dirt. It looked relatively new, but there were no signs of the person who owned it. I picked up the boot and examined it. It was a decent brand, the kind serious hikers use. I figured someone must have lost it, so I decided to take it back to the ranger station and log it in. Maybe someone would come looking for it. But as I stood up, I noticed something else. There was a faint trail of blood leading off the path and into the dense forest. Now, I've seen some weird things in my time as a ranger, but this was different. My first thought was that someone had gotten hurt and needed help, so I followed the trail. It was faint but steady, leading me deeper into the woods. The further I went, the darker it got. The trees were thicker here, and the sunlight barely penetrated through the canopy. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, but beneath that, there was another smell. Faint but metallic, the smell of blood. I kept walking, calling out occasionally, "Hello? Anyone out there? Are you hurt?" No response. I started to feel uneasy. The silence was oppressive. Then I heard it, a rustling noise like someone or something moving through the underbrush. I stopped and listened. The noise stopped too. I called out again, but no answer. I continued following the trail, which eventually led me to a small clearing. What I saw there made my blood run cold. There was a tent, partially collapsed, with blood smeared across its entrance. Nearby, I saw more personal belongings scattered around a backpack, some clothes, and a flashlight. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. Still nothing. I approached the tent cautiously and peeked inside. It was empty, but the amount of blood suggested that someone had been seriously injured. I stepped back and scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. Just then, I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding. Standing there, partially hidden behind a tree, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as it stepped into the clearing, I realized it was something else entirely. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with a gaunt, almost skeletal frame. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes were sunken and hollow. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it was sizing me up. I froze, unsure of what to do. My training hadn't prepared me for this. The creature let out a low, guttural noise, and I instinctively reached for my radio. "This is Ranger Dupree. I need backup at my location now," I shouted into the mic. There was a crackle of static, but no response. I cursed under my breath and started to back away slowly, never taking my eyes off the creature. It followed my movements, matching me step for step. I knew I couldn't outrun it, so I had to think fast. I glanced around the clearing and saw a large stick lying nearby. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I grabbed it and held it out in front of me, trying to appear as threatening as possible. "Stay back," I yelled. The creature paused, tilting its head as if it was curious. Then, without warning, it lunged at me. I swung the stick, hitting it across the head, but it barely flinched. It grabbed the stick and snapped it in half like it was a twig. I stumbled backward and tripped over a rock, falling to the ground. The creature loomed over me, its hollow eyes staring into mine. Just as it reached out, I heard the sound of engines in the distance. Backup was finally on the way. The creature seemed to realize this too, and it backed away, disappearing into the forest. I lay there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. When the other rangers arrived, I told them what had happened. They looked skeptical, but they could see the blood and the wrecked campsite. We conducted a thorough search of the area, but there was no sign of the creature. We did find more blood and some tracks that didn't match any known animal in the area. It was like the thing had just vanished. Over the next few days, we continued to search for the missing hiker, but we never found them. The blood and belongings were logged, and an investigation was opened, but there were no leads. The other rangers treated it as a tragic accident, but I knew better. I'd seen the creature with my own eyes. I kept working at the park, but I was always on edge, especially when I was alone. I never saw the creature again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, watching, waiting. I made sure to warn hikers to stay on the main trails and never venture too far off the beaten path. A few months later, another hiker went missing under similar circumstances. This time, there was no trace of them at all. The authorities chalked it up to the dangers of the wilderness, but I knew the truth. There was something in those woods, something that didn't belong. I eventually left my job as a ranger. The stress and fear became too much to handle. I moved to a small town, far from any forests, and tried to put the experience behind me. But even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, hearing that low, guttural noise in my dreams. I told my story to a few friends, but they didn't believe me. I can't blame them. It sounds crazy, like something out of a horror movie. But I know what I saw. I know what happened. And I know that whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere. That's why I'm telling you this. If you're ever out in the woods, be careful. Stay on the trails. And if you see something that doesn't seem right, get out of there. Don't wait to find out what it is. Trust me, you don't want to know. My experience left me scarred, both physically and mentally. I still have nightmares about that day. I've tried to move on with my life, but it's not easy. I've taken up woodworking to keep myself busy and distract my mind. It helps, but there's always that lingering fear in the back of my mind. Sometimes I think about going back to the park, just to see if I can find any answers. But then I remember the look in that creature's eyes, and I know it's better to leave it alone. Some things are better left undiscovered. Life goes on, and I've tried to rebuild mine as best as I can. I've met new friends, started new hobbies, and even found a new job in a quiet little bookstore. It's a far cry from the excitement and danger of being a park ranger, but it's peaceful. And that's what I need now. Every now and then I hear about missing hikers or strange sightings in the woods, and I wonder if it's the same creature. I've considered reaching out to the authorities or the media, but I doubt they'd take me seriously. So I keep my story to myself, sharing it only with those I trust. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them have happy endings. I've come to accept that. But if my story can serve as a warning, then maybe it was worth it. Stay safe out there, and remember, some paths are best left untraveled. In the end, life is about moving forward, even when the past haunts you. I've learned to find joy in the little things. A good book, a warm cup of coffee, the laughter of friends. These are the things that keep me grounded, that remind me there's still good in the world. So if you ever find yourself in the woods and things start to feel wrong, trust your instincts. Get out while you can. And if you ever hear a rustling in the bushes, remember my story. Sometimes the unknown is better left unknown. That's my story. As unbelievable as it may seem, it's not a happy tale, but it's mine, and now it's yours too. Take it with you, share it, and stay safe. Life is too precious to lose to the things that lurk in the shadows. It was 1994, and I was spending the weekend at a remote cabin in Vermont, trying to get away from my hectic job as an IT specialist. My name is Warren Albright, and I've always preferred solitude over crowds, which is probably why I ended up spending most of my career in dark server rooms, hidden behind screens. There's a calmness to working alone, a quiet focus I've come to rely on. My coworkers called me methodical, even a bit obsessive, but to me, it was just attention to detail. That trait saved my skin more times than I can count when fixing systems that others deemed beyond repair. But this weekend was supposed to be different. A break from the usual chaos, a chance to recharge. The cabin wasn't mine, but my old buddy Greg had offered it up when he heard I needed a change of pace. Greg and I had grown up together in Connecticut, and though we hadn't stayed in touch as much as I liked, he still reached out from time to time, offering up these random acts of generosity. Greg's cabin was isolated, nestled deep in the woods, a solid 40-minute drive from the nearest town. I welcomed the silence, the lack of cell service, and the absence of constant email alerts. It was perfect, until it wasn't. On my second night there, I decided to build a fire. I found a good stack of wood outside, though most of it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The air felt cooler than I expected for late summer, and as the evening wore on, an unsettling chill crept through the gaps in the cabin's walls. I threw a few more logs onto the fire, trying to beat back the cold. But the feeling in my gut wasn't from the temperature. There was a sound outside. At first I ignored it, chalking it up to a wild animal wandering through the brush. But it was persistent. Rhythmic twigs snapping, something or someone moving out there. I'm not the paranoid type, but being alone in the middle of nowhere will do things to your mind. I convinced myself it was nothing more than a deer or some curious raccoons, but the noise didn't fade. It grew closer, louder. Finally, I stood up, grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the kitchen counter, and made my way to the front door. When I opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how quiet everything became. The chirping of the crickets, the rustling of the wind through the trees, it had all vanished. My flashlight beam sliced through the dark, illuminating the trees ahead. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything unusual. I felt foolish, standing there in my boots and flannel shirt, half expecting some animal to appear from the shadows. I turned back to the cabin, letting out a laugh at my own stupidity, when I heard it again. This time the noise was unmistakable. Something heavy shifted in the trees to my right. I swung the flashlight over, but again nothing. No animal, no tracks, nothing that would explain the sound. Just as I was about to turn and head back inside, I caught a glimpse of something. It was low to the ground, maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and moving quickly. It darted between two trees, just at the edge of my vision, like a blur of fur and limbs. I froze, staring at the spot where it disappeared. For a second, I told myself it was just my imagination, but then I heard a soft thud, like something hitting the ground hard. I followed the sound with my light, my pulse quickening. What I saw made my stomach twist. It was a deer carcass. Its hind legs were missing, the flesh torn apart in a way I'd never seen before. Whatever had done this wasn't a predator I recognized. No bear or mountain lion could have mauled an animal like this. The injuries were too precise, too violent. That's when I saw it again. The creature was crouched low, hidden in the underbrush. But this time I could make out more of its form. It was roughly the size of a large dog, but its body was twisted, almost unnatural, with long, sinewy limbs that reminded me of a spider. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it moved with an eerie silence, like it was gliding rather than walking. It looked at me, but not with eyes. There were no visible features where its face should have been, just smooth, pale skin that stretched across its head like a featureless mask. I backed away, trying not to make any sudden moves. But it didn't react. It stayed in place, watching or sensing me, as if it was waiting for something. I don't know what possessed me to speak, but I did. "What the hell are you?" The thing tilted its head slightly, as if it understood me. Then, before I could even register what was happening, it bolted. I barely had time to blink before it vanished into the trees, leaving behind the mangled deer. My legs were shaking, my mind scrambling to process what I had just seen. I rushed back inside the cabin, locking the door behind me. Though I knew that wouldn't be enough if that thing wanted in, I grabbed the shotgun Greg kept mounted above the fireplace. I wasn't much of a hunter, but right then, holding that gun felt like the only thing tethering me to some sense of safety. The night dragged on. I sat by the fire, the shotgun on my lap, listening to every creak, every whisper of wind outside. Sleep wasn't an option. Every few minutes I would glance out the window, expecting to see that pale, twisted figure lurking just beyond the tree line. But it never came back. Not that night. By morning, I had convinced myself to leave. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something I wanted to encounter again. I threw my things into the trunk of my car, double-checking the locks on the cabin out of some misplaced sense of duty to Greg. As I started the engine, I caught a glimpse of something in the rear-view mirror. It was the deer, or at least what was left of it. The body was gone, but the head remained, placed carefully in the middle of the dirt path, facing the cabin, like some kind of warning. I floored it, gravel kicking up as I sped down the dirt road. I haven't been back to Greg's cabin since. I never told him what happened, and I doubt I ever will. Whatever that thing was, I can't explain it. But I know one thing for certain. I wasn't the first person it's crossed paths with, and I sure as hell won't be the last. As I reached the highway, I saw a sign for a wildlife research center up ahead. A part of me wanted to pull in, to ask if anyone had seen something similar. But what would I say? That I saw a creature out in the woods, one that didn't belong in any natural world I'd ever known. Instead, I kept driving, leaving that thing and whatever it had planned far behind. But as I passed the last sign for the research center, a thought crossed my mind. Whatever it wasn't a natural predator. It was something older, something different. It moved like a spider, hunted like one too. Maybe that's what it was. A spider, just not the kind anyone would expect to find crawling through the woods of Vermont. The truth? I'll never know. But the memory of that creature, its pale skin, its unnatural movements, and its faceless head, will forever haunt the shadows of my mind. My name's Declan, and I've been a park ranger for about 5 years now. I've always loved the outdoors, probably because I grew up on a farm in Kansas. The wide open spaces, the fresh air, and the quiet, they've always been my kind of thing. I took this job in the backwoods of Pennsylvania for exactly that reason. Most days, it's just me and the trees. I check the trails, make sure the campers aren't being idiots, and occasionally I get to rescue someone who thought they could take on nature without a map or common sense. This story I'm about to tell you, though, it's not about lost hikers or bears getting into the trash. This one's different, and I'm not sure I've got it all figured out. But here goes. It was a quiet Tuesday. I remember because the weekend rush had passed, and the trails were almost empty. My partner, Evan Daniels, was on vacation, leaving me to cover the whole area alone. I didn't mind. It meant more time to think and less small talk. I started my day as usual, coffee in hand, checking the map in the ranger station. There were a couple of campers up near Pine Ridge and another group down by the lake. The weather was clear, the sun shining through the trees, dappling the forest floor with light. I didn't expect any trouble. Around noon, I decided to take a ride up to Pine Ridge, see how those campers were doing. The drive was uneventful, and I found the campers, a couple of college kids, enjoying their lunch. We chatted for a bit. They seemed like good kids, and then I headed back down the trail. About halfway back, I noticed something odd. There was a strange smell like rotting meat and a weird silence. No birds, no insects, just a heavy quiet. I've spent enough time in these woods to know when something's off. I got out of my truck and started looking around. It didn't take long to find the source of the smell. About 20 yards off the trail, I found a small clearing. In the middle of it was what looked like a pile of clothes. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just clothes, it was a body. One night, I got a call from the group camping near the lake. They'd heard something moving around their tents and were too scared to investigate. I drove out there, my rifle ready. When I arrived, the campers were huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "It's out there," one of them whispered. "It's watching us." I told them to stay put and walk towards the edge of the campsite. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the trees. I heard a rustling noise and turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it, standing just a few feet away. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with long, thin limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. It didn't move, just watched me with those terrible eyes. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking. The thing cocked its head, almost like it was curious. Then it lunged at me. I fired, the shot echoing through the trees, but it was too fast. It knocked me to the ground, its claws raking across my chest. I struggled, kicking and punching, but it was like fighting a shadow. Finally, I managed to grab my knife and slash at its arm. It let out a high-pitched scream and backed off, disappearing into the woods. I lay there bleeding and gasping for breath until the campers found me and called for help. The paramedics arrived quickly, and I was rushed to the hospital. I had deep gashes across my chest and arms, but nothing life-threatening. The doctors patched me up and gave me some painkillers, but they couldn't do anything for the nightmares. I told the police what happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I'd been attacked by a bear, or maybe even a human. But I knew the truth. There was something in those woods, something that wasn't human. The guy was lying face down, his back torn open like something had clawed at him. He looked young, maybe early 20s, wearing a t-shirt and jeans. I called it in, of course. The police arrived pretty quickly, given the location. Detective Morgan, a grizzled guy in his 50s, took charge. We scoured the area, but there was nothing to find. No tracks, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was like the guy had just been dropped there. They took the body away, and I went back to my rounds. But that scene stuck with me. A few days later, I was out checking the southern trails when I heard it. A scream, loud and piercing, cutting through the afternoon calm. I radioed it in and ran towards the sound. I found a woman, probably in her 30s, sitting on the ground holding her leg. She'd tripped and twisted her ankle, but that wasn't what had made her scream. She kept babbling about something in the woods, something that had been watching her. I helped her back to her campsite and waited with her until her friends returned. They thanked me and promised to take her to the hospital. I tried to shake off her words, but they lingered. I couldn't help but wonder if it was connected to the body I'd found. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the woman's fear, the body in the clearing, and the strange silence in the woods. Around midnight, I decided to go for a walk, try to clear my head. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, sticking to the well-worn paths near the station. I hadn't gone far when I saw it, a figure just at the edge of my light, tall, hunched, with long limbs that didn't look quite right. It moved quickly, silently, disappearing into the trees before I could get a good look. My heart was pounding, and I felt a chill run through me. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I knew better. Over the next few days, I kept seeing it, always at the edge of my vision, always disappearing before I could get close. I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, but deep down I knew something was out there. I started carrying my rifle with me, just in case. One evening I decided to set up a camera trap. If something was out there, I wanted proof. I set it up near where I'd seen the figure the most, baited it with some food, and left it overnight. The next morning, I retrieved the camera and checked the footage. Most of it was just trees and the occasional raccoon. But then, around 3:20 a.m., I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, with glowing eyes. It moved strangely, almost like it was gliding rather than walking. It reached out, long, pale fingers brushing the camera, and then the footage cut out. I took the footage to the station and showed it to my boss, Chief Ranger Kincaid. He watched it in silence, then looked at me, his face pale. "That's unsettling," he said finally. "But it could be anything, a prank, a trick of the light." "It's not a prank," I insisted. "There's something out there, and it's not human." He sighed. "Look, Declan, I know you're spooked, but we can't jump to conclusions. Just keep an eye out and report anything unusual." I nodded, but I could tell he didn't believe me. I went back to my rounds, feeling more uneasy than ever. Over the next week, things got worse. More campers reported strange noises, shadows in the trees, and a sense of being watched. I found more tracks, but they were unlike anything I'd seen before, large, with long claw-like toes. One night, I got a call from the group camping near the lake. They'd heard something moving around their tents and were too scared to investigate. I drove out there, my rifle ready. When I arrived, the campers were huddled together, their faces pale with fear. "It's out there," one of them whispered. "It's watching us." I told them to stay put and walked towards the edge of the campsite. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the trees. I heard a rustling noise and turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I saw it, standing just a few feet away. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with long, thin limbs and pale, almost translucent skin. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth was filled with sharp, needle-like teeth. It didn't move, just watched me with those terrible eyes. I raised my rifle, but my hands were shaking. The thing cocked its head, almost like it was curious. Then it lunged at me. I fired, the shot echoing through the trees, but it was too fast. It knocked me to the ground, its claws raking across my chest. I struggled, kicking and punching, but it was like fighting a shadow. Finally, I managed to grab my knife and slash at its arm. It let out a high-pitched scream and backed off, disappearing into the woods. I lay there bleeding and gasping for breath until the campers found me and called for help. The paramedics arrived quickly, and I was rushed to the hospital. I had deep gashes across my chest and arms, but nothing life-threatening. The doctors patched me up and gave me some painkillers, but they couldn't do anything for the nightmares. I told the police what happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I'd been attacked by a bear, or maybe even a human. But I knew the truth. There was something in those woods, something that wasn't human. A few days later, I went back to the station. I was determined to find out what was going on. I spent hours researching local legends and folklore, looking for anything that matched what I'd seen. Finally, I came across a story about a creature called the Night Stalker. It was said to be an ancient, malevolent spirit that preyed on humans, luring them into the woods and devouring their souls. It sounded crazy, but it was the only explanation that made sense. I showed the story to Chief Kincaid, but he just shook his head. "Declan, you've been through a lot. Maybe you should take some time off, get some rest." "I don't need rest," I snapped. "I need answers. People are in danger." He sighed. "All right, but be careful and keep me informed." I spent the next few days setting up more cameras and traps, hoping to catch the creature on film. I patrolled the woods day and night, my rifle always at the ready. But the Night Stalker was smart. It avoided my traps and cameras, always staying one step ahead. Then one night, it all came to a head. I was on patrol near the northern edge of the park when I heard a scream. I ran towards the sound, my heart pounding. I found a young man, maybe 19 or 20, lying on the ground. He was bleeding heavily from his neck, his eyes wide with terror. "It got me," he gasped. "It's coming." I tried to stop the bleeding, but it was no use. He died in my arms, his blood soaking into the ground. I looked up and saw the Night Stalker standing there, watching me. It tilted its head and grinned, its teeth glinting in the moonlight. I raised my rifle and fired, but it moved too fast. It was on me in an instant, its claws tearing at my flesh. I fought back, but it was like fighting a shadow. Finally, I managed to stab it with my knife, and it let out that horrible scream again, backing off. I lay there bleeding and exhausted as the creature disappeared into the trees. I knew I couldn't keep this up. The Night Stalker was too strong, too fast. I needed help. The next day, I called a friend of mine, a retired ranger named Hank Lawson. Hank was a tough old guy with more experience than anyone I knew. If anyone could help me, it was him. Hank arrived the next day, and we spent hours going over my notes and footage. He was skeptical at first, but after seeing the evidence, he agreed to help. We spent the next week setting up new traps and cameras, using everything we could think of to catch the Night Stalker. Finally, one night, we got lucky. We were patrolling near the southern edge of the park when we heard a noise. We followed it to a small clearing, where we found the Night Stalker caught in one of our traps. It thrashed and screamed, trying to break free, but the trap held. Hank and I approached cautiously, our rifles ready. The creature glared at us, its eyes burning with hatred. It spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You think you can stop me? I am eternal. I am the darkness. We'll see about that." Hank muttered and fired his rifle. The bullet hit the creature in the chest, and it let out a scream of pain. It thrashed harder, trying to break free, but we kept firing, determined to bring it down. Finally, with one last horrible scream, the Night Stalker fell silent. It lay there, its body twitching as the life drained from its eyes. We approached cautiously, making sure it was dead, then dragged it back to the station. The police were called, and they took the body away. They didn't know what to make of it, but I didn't care. The Night Stalker was dead, and the park was safe. In the days that followed, things returned to normal. The campers came back, and the strange sightings stopped. I went back to my rounds, but I never forgot what happened. I knew that there were things out there, things that defied explanation. But I also knew that as long as I was around, I'd do everything I could to keep people safe. That's my story. Believe it or not, it's the truth. There's more out there than we can see, more than we can understand. And sometimes, the only thing standing between us and the darkness is a guy with a rifle and a lot of determination. I never really thought much about the national park where I worked, just another place to spend my days, I guess. You could say I was always a bit of a loner, happy to wander the trails and keep an eye on the wildlife. My name's Darren Cole, and I've been a park ranger at Blackwood National Park for about 10 years now. It's one of those jobs where you think you've seen it all, but then something happens that shakes you to your core. It started out like any other day, a typical work shift in one of the most serene and untouched parts of the country. Blackwood is known for its dense forests, towering pine trees, and crystal clear lakes. Tourists love it for the hiking and the chance to see wildlife, and I love it for the peace and quiet. There's a tranquility here that you can't find anywhere else, or at least that's what I used to think. My shift began with the usual patrol of the park's main trails. I was supposed to check in on a couple of campsites and make sure everything was in order. As I walked through the forest, the morning sun casting long shadows through the trees, I felt that familiar sense of calm. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds chirping and leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Little did I know this day would be far from ordinary. Around midday, I reached a secluded campsite by the edge of Lake Serene, one of the park's less frequented spots. It was usually quiet, a perfect spot for those looking to escape the hustle and bustle of city life. But as I approached, I noticed something was off. The campsite was a mess. Tents ripped apart, belongings scattered everywhere, and there was no one in sight. "Hello," I called out, hoping to find the campers. Silence. My heart started to pound in my chest. This wasn't normal. I pulled out my radio to call for backup, but all I got was static. Great. Just what I needed. I decided to investigate further, hoping to find some clue as to what had happened. As I searched the area, I found bloodstains on the ground leading into the forest. A chill ran down my spine. This was bad, really bad. I followed the trail cautiously, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife on my belt. I wasn't armed with a gun park policy. Never needed one before. Guess they figured the biggest threat out here was a pissed-off raccoon. The trail led me deeper into the forest, and the further I went, the darker it got. The trees seemed to close in around me, blocking out the sunlight. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence fell over the forest. That's when I saw it. A figure crouched over something on the ground. "Hey, you there," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative. The figure didn't move. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't human. It was some kind of creature, hunched over a body, its back covered in matted dark fur with spikes protruding from its spine. I froze, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. The creature turned its head slowly, and for a brief moment, our eyes met. They were empty, soulless. It let out a low, guttural snarl, and before I could react, it lunged at me. I barely had time to dive out of the way, rolling to my feet and drawing my knife. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be real. The creature circled me, moving with a speed and agility that was terrifying. I slashed at it with my knife, but it was like trying to hit a shadow. It was toying with me, letting me exhaust myself. I needed a plan, and fast. I glanced around, looking for anything that could help me. My eyes landed on a fallen branch, thick and sturdy enough to use as a weapon. I lunged for it, grabbing the branch and swinging it at the creature with all my strength. The branch connected with a sickening thud, and the creature staggered back, letting out a roar of pain. I didn't wait for it to recover. I took off running, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I had to get out of there, had to warn the others. I burst out of the trees and back into the campsite, my mind racing. There was no way I could take that thing on my own. I needed help, and I needed it now. I grabbed the radio again, praying it would work this time. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Ranger Cole at Lake Serene. We have an emergency. There's something out here. I need backup now." Finally, a crackle of static and a voice came through. "Cole, this is Ranger Clark. What's going on?" "Just get here, Clark. It's bad. Real bad." I waited, my heart pounding as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the image of that creature, its soulless eyes, its sheer savagery. When Clark and the others arrived, I briefed them quickly. We were a small team, just 4 of us, but we had to do something. We couldn't let that thing roam free in the park. Armed with whatever we could find, knives, branches, even a couple of flares, we set out to track the creature. As we ventured back into the forest, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The trees seemed to loom over us, casting long shadows that danced in the dim light. Every step felt like it could be our last. We followed the blood trail deeper and deeper into the woods. Then we heard it, a low guttural growl that sent shivers down our spines. The creature was close, too close. We moved slowly, cautiously, trying to pinpoint its location. Suddenly, it sprang from the underbrush, claws bared, teeth gnashing. It took down Ranger Tompkins before any of us could react, ripping into him with a ferocity that was beyond comprehension. Tompkins? No, Clark shouted, rushing forward with his knife. But the creature was too fast. It knocked Clark aside like he was nothing, sending him crashing into a tree. I could see the terror in his eyes, the realization that we were up against something far beyond our understanding. I knew we had to act fast. I grabbed one of the flares and ignited it, the bright light casting an eerie glow over the forest. The creature recoiled, hissing and snarling at the sudden burst of light. It was vulnerable. This was our chance. Now, hit it now, I shouted, waving the flare at the creature. The others joined in, swinging their makeshift weapons, trying to drive it back. The creature lashed out, but the light seemed to weaken it, slow it down. We pressed the attack, pushing it further into the trees. It was a desperate, chaotic battle. The creature fought with a savagery that was almost primal, but we were relentless. We couldn't afford to let it escape. Finally, with one last desperate lunge, we drove it back into a clearing. The creature stumbled, its movements growing sluggish. "Keep it up. Don't let it recover," Clark shouted, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. We surrounded the creature, our flares burning brightly, casting long shadows over the clearing. The creature let out a final, anguished roar before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching violently. We stood there, gasping for breath, staring at the lifeless form of the creature. It was over. We had won. But at what cost? Tompkins was gone and Clark was badly injured. We had faced something beyond our wildest nightmares, something that defied explanation. We radioed for a helicopter to evacuate the injured and to report what had happened. The response team arrived quickly, and the forest was soon swarming with rangers and medical personnel. They took one look at the creature and knew this wasn't something they were prepared for. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying Clark and the remains of Tompkins, I stood there in the clearing, staring at the creature. I had no idea what it was, where it had come from, or if there were more like it out there. But I knew one thing for sure. Blackwood National Park would never be the same again. I spent the rest of the day with the team, answering questions, filling out reports. There was a lot of speculation, a lot of theories, but no real answers. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't something we could easily explain away. By the time I finally got back to my cabin, the sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the forest. I was exhausted, mentally and physically. I sat on the porch, staring out at the trees, trying to process everything that had happened. I don't know what's out there in the depths of Blackwood National Park, but I do know this. It's something we can't afford to ignore. We've got a responsibility to protect this place and the people who visit it, and that means being prepared for anything, even the unimaginable. As I sat there, watching the shadows lengthen and the stars begin to appear, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. There are things in this world we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason, but we have to face them, no matter how terrifying they might be. You see, when you've been a small-town cop for as long as I have, you learn that there's a rhythm to things. Not a comforting rhythm, mind you, but a rhythm nonetheless. A dark undercurrent that runs beneath the everyday noise of life. My name's Evan Harker, and I've been the sheriff of Wilson's Grove for over 15 years. It's a place that doesn't ask much of you, so long as you keep your head down and your nose clean. But when something does happen, when that undercurrent rises to the surface, it's never good. It's always something you wish you hadn't seen, something you'll never forget, no matter how hard you try. I was born and raised here, in this little town nestled between two forgotten highways, surrounded by miles of dense, ancient forest. My dad was the sheriff before me, and his dad before him. It's not a job you take because you want to. It's a job you take because you have to. It's in the blood, I guess. Most of the time, it's just noise complaints, bar fights, and the occasional missing dog. The real crimes happen in the cities, where people think they can get away with anything because they're just another face in the crowd. Not here, though. Here we know everybody by name, by face, by smell, and we're all too familiar with their problems. So when a few hikers went missing last month, I figured it was the usual, a couple of out-of-towners getting lost in the woods. Happens more often than you'd think. The forest around here isn't friendly. It's old, tangled, and it doesn't take kindly to strangers. We've had more than our fair share of search and rescue operations over the years, most ending with a sheepish couple thanking us for finding them after spending a night huddled under a tree. But this time was different. The first call came in on a Tuesday. Two hikers, a man and a woman, mid-30s. A local kid found their car parked at the trailhead, dust starting to gather on the hood. He thought it was odd that they hadn't come back yet, but I wasn't too concerned. Not at first. I took a drive out there just to make sure, and found their car right where the kid said it would be. No sign of the hikers, though. Just an empty car with a couple of water bottles and an old map on the front seat. I called it in and got a few deputies together to start a search. The woods were thick, the air heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. But we had done this before. Fan out, stay within sight of each other, and make plenty of noise. But as we moved deeper into the forest, the atmosphere started to change. It was subtle at first, a kind of stillness that pressed down on you, made you feel like you were being watched. I've been in those woods my whole life, but I'd never felt anything like this. After a couple of hours, we found the first body. It was the man, or what was left of him, anyway. He was sprawled out on the forest floor, half buried under a pile of leaves. The look on his face was one of sheer terror, like he had seen something that his mind couldn't make sense of. His chest was ripped open, ribs snapped like kindling, and his insides were gone. I've seen my share of hunting accidents, but this wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. We kept searching, but it didn't take long to find the woman. She was hanging from a tree, her limbs twisted at unnatural angles, her head tilted as if she was looking down at us. I won't go into detail, but let's just say it was worse than the man. Whatever had done this wasn't just killing, it was mutilating, destroying them in a way that didn't make any sense. We called it in, got the coroner out there, but there wasn't much he could do. He said it looked like a wild animal attack, but even he couldn't tell me what kind of animal could do something like that. The wounds didn't match anything we'd ever seen. It was as if something had taken its time with them, almost like it enjoyed it. That's when I knew this wasn't over. You don't find bodies like that and just walk away. Over the next few days, more reports came in. A couple of local kids went missing. A farmer found his cattle torn apart in their pasture, and an old man swore he saw something moving through his fields at night, something big and fast. The whole town was on edge, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there was getting closer. It was as if it was circling us, tightening the noose. I didn't sleep much during that time. I spent most nights driving around the outskirts of town, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was doing this. But I never did. Not until that last night. It was a Thursday late when the call came in. Mrs. Cunningham, one of the oldest residents in town, said she heard something outside her house, something she couldn't explain. Her voice was shaking, and I could tell she was scared out of her mind. I told her to stay inside, lock the doors, and I'd be there in 5 minutes. I got there in 3. Her house is a small, old thing, sitting alone at the edge of the forest, the kind of place that's charming in the daylight but takes on a whole new character at night. As soon as I pulled up, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick with a smell I couldn't place, something rotten, something that made my stomach turn. I drew my gun, an old habit more than anything, and approached the front door. Mrs. Cunningham was standing in the doorway, her hands trembling as she clutched a shotgun that looked older than she was. "It's in the barn," she whispered. "I saw it go in there, but I couldn't see what it was. Just get it out of here, Evan, please." I nodded and started toward the barn, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell got worse as I got closer, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I could feel it, whatever it was, watching me, waiting for me. The barn doors creaked as I pushed them open, and I stepped inside. The light from my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but it was enough to see the carnage. Blood and pieces of something were scattered everywhere, and in the middle of it all was the thing that had been terrorizing our town. It was crouched low, its back to me, but I could see its twisted, animalistic form. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen. It was something else, something wrong, something that shouldn't exist. It turned toward me, and that's when I fired. I didn't wait, didn't hesitate. I just emptied my gun into it. The thing let out a noise, a scream, maybe, but not like any scream I'd ever heard, and collapsed to the ground. I didn't take my eyes off it as I reloaded, half expecting it to get back up, but it didn't. When I finally approached, gun still drawn, I saw what I'd done. The thing was dead, but it wasn't gone. Its body lay there, as real as the blood on the ground, as real as the stench in the air. I wanted to understand what I was looking at, but my mind wouldn't let me. It was as if my brain was trying to protect me from the truth, trying to keep me sane. Mrs. Cunningham called the next morning to tell me that whatever had been tormenting her was gone, that she could finally sleep. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something close to relief. The thing was dead, and there was no question about it. Its body was lying there in the barn, just like I'd left it. The coroner, the deputies, everyone who saw it knew that whatever it wasn't from this world. They believed me. For once, they believed me. And now, that's all there is to it. The creature is dead, the town is safe, and life has returned to its normal rhythm. But the memory of that night, the sight of that creature, the smell of its blood, those things will stay with me forever. They're a reminder that even in the quietest corners of the world, darkness can lurk, waiting for its chance to rise to the surface. And sometimes, when it does, it leaves scars that never fully heal. It started with the wind, the kind of wind that rattles the bones of a small town, making people lock their doors and pretend they don't hear the eerie whispering outside. It was the kind of wind that carried stories, and none of them good. That night in 1992, it brought something else to the quiet town of Harland, Montana. My name is Deputy Eli Rohr, and if you've ever been to Harland, you know it's the kind of place where nothing happens. That's why most folks like it here. They come to escape the noise, the chaos of bigger cities. We've got our problems, like anyone else. Mostly kids getting too drunk, or the occasional fist fight at McCabe's Tavern, but nothing that can't be settled with a stern talking to, or a night in the drunk tank. But that night was different. That night, everything changed. I was on my usual patrol, making rounds in the old Ford Cruiser when I got the call. There's a stretch of forest on the outskirts of town known as the Hollows. It's not a place folks go willingly. Hunters avoid it, and the kids only dare each other to go there if they're trying to impress someone. The call was from a man named Wallace Gibson, one of the older residents. He said he'd seen something big, dragging itself through the trees. I could hear the tremble in his voice as he described it, and Wallace wasn't a man to scare easily. He was a Vietnam vet, tough as nails. I should have taken it more seriously. But in Harland, you hear things, especially on a windy night. People see shadows where there's nothing, hear noises that don't exist. Still, a job's a job, and I had nothing better to do. I arrived at Wallace's place around 1100 p.m. It was a small, weather-beaten house like most in Harland. Wallace met me at the door, his face pale, eyes wide. He didn't waste time with pleasantries, just pointed a shaking finger toward the tree line. "It's out there, Rohr," he said. "Saw it with my own eyes, big as a moose, but it weren't no moose. Had too many legs, too many damn legs." I stepped outside, my hand resting on the grip of my service weapon. The wind howled through the trees, making them creak and groan like they were alive, like they were trying to tell me something. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, but the beam only seemed to be swallowed by the night. For a moment I considered calling it in, getting someone else out here with me. But this was Harland. You don't call backup for something you can handle yourself. "Where exactly did you see it, Wallace?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. He pointed again, toward a thick patch of trees about 50 yards from his back door. Over there, it was moving slow, like it was hurt. But God roar, it was big. I nodded and made my way toward the trees, the beam of my flashlight slicing through the dark. The ground was soft, almost muddy, and the wind carried the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, the kind of smell you get when you leave meat out too long. As I got closer, I saw the first sign, a trail of broken branches, leaves torn from the trees, and something else, a smear of dark, wet earth, as if something heavy had been dragged through it. I followed the trail deeper into the woods, the wind at my back, pushing me forward. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound, like something struggling to breathe. I froze, the hair on my neck standing on end. I'm not a man who scares easily, but that sound, it wasn't right. It wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. I raised my flashlight and caught a glimpse of something moving ahead. Something massive, hunched over, with long, thin limbs that seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever it wasn't natural. It wasn't something that should exist. I drew my gun and took another step forward, keeping the beam of light steady. The creature, because there was no other word for it, shifted, revealing a body covered in matted, dark fur, patches of skin missing, and bones jutting out at odd angles. But it was the eyes that stopped me, cold black, bottomless pits that seemed to swallow the light, reflecting nothing but darkness. It turned its head toward me, and for a moment we were both still. Then it lunged. I fired, the shot echoing through the trees, but the bullet barely seemed to slow it down. It moved with a speed that defied its size, closing the distance between us in seconds. I felt the searing pain as one of its limbs struck me, knocking me to the ground. The world spun, the trees above me blending into a blur. As I struggled to get back on my feet, I fired again, this time hitting it square in the chest. The creature let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, but close enough to send a shiver down my spine. It staggered, its limbs flailing wildly, but still it came. In the chaos, I lost my flashlight, the darkness closing in around me. I fired blindly, the gunshots lighting up the night in brief flashes, each one showing the creature getting closer. My mind raced, trying to figure out how to kill something that shouldn't be alive in the first place. Finally, I hit something vital. The creature let out a final, desperate sound before collapsing to the ground, its body twitching before going still. I didn't move for what felt like hours, waiting for it to get back up, to attack again. But it didn't. Whatever life had been keeping it moving was gone. I staggered to my feet, clutching my side where it had struck me. My hand came away sticky with blood, but I was alive. I limped over to where the creature lay and shone the light on it. It was dead, its body twisted in death, limbs bent at impossible angles. There was no doubt it was real. I had the wounds to prove it. I called it in, and the rest of the night was a blur of emergency lights, paramedics, and questions I couldn't answer. Wallace was right. People don't scare easily in Harland, but that night, they did. The next day, the creature was gone. Not vanished, hauled away by the state authorities who swooped in like vultures, telling us to keep our mouths shut. But there were witnesses, and too many people had seen the body for it to be just another wild animal attack. It was on the front page of the local paper the next morning, the headline blaring, Unknown creature killed by local deputy. They kept the details vague, of course, because no one wanted to admit what it really was, or worse, that there might be more of them out there. But there was no denying the truth. I wasn't crazy, Wallace wasn't crazy, and Harland would never be the same. The quiet rhythm of our lives had been disrupted, irrevocably altered by the intrusion of something monstrous, something that defied explanation. And as I looked out at the familiar streets and the whispering trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness we had glimpsed that night was still out there, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for its chance to return. I never really thought much about taking detours. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Get lost for a bit? Turn around and find your way back? Well, let me tell you, I was wrong. Dead wrong. My name's Greg Mathers, and I'm not much for long drives. But work had sent me out to visit a potential client in the mountains of North Carolina. After a week of dead ends and wasted time, I was finally heading back home. The thought of a hot shower and my own bed kept me going. I pulled off at a little gas station just outside of Asheville. The place was worn down, a relic from the 70s, with cracked asphalt and faded signs. The attendant, an old man with a scruffy beard and a cap that had seen better days, leaned against the door frame, eyeing me with mild curiosity. "Fill it up?" he asked, and I nodded. After paying, I consulted my map. Yeah, I still use one of those. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't trust GPS. Too many stories about people getting lost because of some satellite glitch. The map showed a shortcut through the Pisgah National Forest. I figured it would save me at least an hour. "Is this road any good?" I asked the attendant, pointing to a thin line snaking through the green expanse on the map. He squinted at the map, then at me. "Not many folks take that route. It's pretty rough and you can easily get turned around. But it's shorter, right?" "Yeah, shorter. But if you're not familiar, it can be tricky." I thanked him, decided I could handle a bit of rough terrain, and set off. The road started out fine, just a narrow 2-lane winding up into the hills. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Trees grew thicker on either side, and soon the asphalt gave way to gravel. My old sedan wasn't exactly built for this, but I kept going, figuring it couldn't be too bad. About an hour in, I realized my mistake. The gravel turned to dirt, and the road began to split off into numerous smaller paths. It was getting late, the sun already dipping below the tree line, and the last thing I needed was to be lost in the woods at night. I pulled over to consult my map again, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. That's when I noticed the cabin. It was a small, run-down place half hidden by overgrown bushes. Figuring I might get some directions, I approached and knocked on the door. It creaked open and I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" A woman appeared, middle-aged, with stringy hair and a wary look in her eye. "What do you want?" "I'm trying to get back to the highway. Think I took a wrong turn." She looked me up and down, then stepped aside. "Come in. I'll get my brother. He knows these woods." I hesitated. The cabin looked deserted, and the woman's wary expression did little to reassure me. But I was lost. It was getting dark, and I didn't have many options. I stepped inside. The cabin was dark and cluttered, the air thick with the musty smell of damp wood and something else. something faintly metallic that made my nose wrinkle. The woman disappeared into another room, leaving me alone. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but before I could act, the door behind me opened, and two men stepped in. "Lost, huh?" one of them said. He was tall and lanky, with a wild look in his eyes. The other, shorter but more solid, just stared at me, unblinking. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just need directions." "Directions," the taller one repeated, his voice mocking. "We can help with that, but it'll cost you." I laughed nervously. "I've got some cash." "Oh, we're not interested in money," the shorter one said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I turned to leave, but the woman was blocking the door. The tall one grabbed my arm, his grip like a vice. "You're not going anywhere," he hissed. I fought, kicking and swinging, but they overpowered me, dragging me into the back room. It was a nightmare come to life. Old chains hung from the ceiling, and the floor was stained with something dark that I didn't want to identify. Panic surged through me as they tied me to a chair, the ropes cutting into my wrists. The woman stood in the corner, watching with a twisted smile. "We don't get many visitors," she said, "but when we do, we make sure they don't leave." I struggled against the ropes, my mind racing. "You don't have to do this," I pleaded. The shorter man leaned in, his breath rancid. "Oh, but we do. It's tradition." Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time lost all meaning in that dark room. They taunted me, took turns beating me, and laughed at my pain. Desperation gave way to a cold, hard clarity. I had to escape, or I wouldn't make it out alive. At some point, they left me alone, probably thinking I was too weak to resist. But adrenaline is a powerful thing. I managed to slip one hand free, the rope burning my skin. I worked on the other, my heart pounding in my ears. Finally, I was loose. I waited, listening for any sound. Hearing none, I crept to the door. It was unlocked. I moved quietly, every creak of the floorboards like a gunshot in the silence. The main room was empty, but I could hear voices outside. They were arguing about something. It didn't matter. This was my chance. I bolted for the back door, running blindly into the woods. Branches slapped at my face, and roots threatened to trip me, but I kept going. Behind me, I heard shouts and the sounds of pursuit. I didn't dare look back. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. The forest was a maze, but luck was on my side. I stumbled onto a dirt road just as a truck was passing. I waved frantically, and the driver, a burly man in his 40s, slammed on the brakes. "Help," I gasped. "They're after me." He didn't ask questions, just yanked open the door and pulled me inside. "Who?" "A family. They tried to kill me." "Jesus," he muttered, flooring the gas. "Hold on." We sped down the road, the truck bouncing over the rough terrain. I glanced back, but there was no sign of my pursuers. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a ranger station. The driver, whose name I learned was Hank, barged in, demanding to see the ranger. The ranger, a grizzled veteran named Mark, took one look at me and got on the radio. Within minutes, the place was swarming with deputies. They listened to my story, then geared up to hunt the family down. "Stay here," Hank told me. "You're safe now." I nodded, exhaustion crashing over me as they headed into the forest. I slumped in a chair, barely conscious. The next few hours were a blur. They found the cabin, but it was empty. The family had vanished, leaving behind a grisly scene that confirmed my story. They searched the woods, but the cannibals were gone, likely disappearing into the vast forest they knew so well. The deputies found evidence of other victims, confirming my worst fears. This family had been at it for years, preying on travelers who took the wrong turn. My testimony would help put them away for good, if they were ever caught. Hank stayed with me, a steady presence in the chaos. "You're lucky, kid," he said. "Not many make it out." "Yeah," I said, my voice hollow. "We never found the family. But they didn't find me either." My name is Carter Gents, and I'm a search and rescue officer for the United States Forest Service. I've seen my fair share of strange things out in the woods, but nothing could prepare me for what happened that day. It started like any other. I was out patrolling the expanse of the Adirondack Mountains, one of the most picturesque yet treacherous terrains on the East Coast. The Adirondacks are a maze of dense forests, rocky peaks, and hidden lakes, stretching over 6 million acres. It's a place where nature's beauty and danger coexist, drawing adventurers and wanderers alike. As a seasoned SAR officer, my job involves navigating these wilds to find lost hikers, rescue injured climbers, and occasionally recover bodies. That day, I was assigned to check on a remote cabin owned by an elderly couple, the Palmers. They were well known around these parts, living off the grid and refusing to move closer to civilization. The previous week, we'd received a call from their worried daughter Julia, who hadn't heard from them in over a month. It wasn't uncommon for communication to be sporadic out here, but a month was concerning. I set off early, my pack loaded with the essentials: first aid kit, ropes, radio, and a few days' worth of rations. The trail to the Palmer's cabin was rugged, hardly more than a game path, and it was about a 10-mile hike from the nearest road. It was slow going, the summer heat oppressive even under the thick canopy of trees. The air was heavy with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, and the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. Around midday, I reached the cabin. It was a small, sturdy structure made of logs, with a patch of cleared land around it. The place looked untouched, a serene picture of wilderness living. But as I approached, I noticed something was off. The air smelled wrong, metallic and sour. It's the kind of scent that sets the hairs on the back of your neck on edge. "Mr. Palmer? Mrs. Palmer?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense forest. There was no response. I walked up to the door, which was slightly ajar, and pushed it open. The sight inside was enough to make me gag. The Palmers were there, but they weren't alive. Their bodies were torn apart, mauled in a way that no bear or cougar could manage. Blood and gore painted the walls, a horrifying tableau of violence. I've seen bodies before, but this was different. The sheer brutality suggested something far more sinister. I forced myself to stay composed, stepping back outside to call for backup. The radio crackled to life, and I relayed the grim news. "Base, this is Gents. I need immediate assistance at the Palmer cabin. Possible animal attack. but it doesn't look like anything I've seen before. Over. Copy that, gents. Hold tight. Help is on the way. Over. With backup on the way. I knew I had to secure the area, but something in the back of my mind told me I wasn't alone. I scanned the tree line, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. Something large and shadowy darting between the trees. It was fast, too fast for any known animal in these parts. My instinct screamed at me to get inside, to barricade the doors and wait for help. But curiosity, and perhaps a bit of foolish bravery, won out. I grabbed my rifle from my pack and cautiously followed the direction where I'd seen the movement. The woods felt different now, oppressive. Each step was accompanied by the feeling of being watched, but I kept going. I found the first sign about half a mile from the cabin. It was a massive footprint, larger than any bear's, with elongated toes and deep claw marks. Whatever made it was big and heavy. As I examined the print, a low rustling came from the bushes nearby. I turned, rifle raised, just in time to catch a glimpse of something slipping into the shadows. It was then that I heard the first scream. It was human, unmistakable, and it was coming from the direction of the cabin. I sprinted back, heart pounding, dread gnawing at my gut. When I broke through the trees, I saw two hikers, a man and a woman, running towards me, their faces pale with terror. "Help, please help us," the woman screamed, tears streaming down her face. I motioned for them to get behind me. "What happened? What did you see?" It's a monster," the man stammered. "It tore through our campsite, killed our friend." The rational part of me wanted to dismiss their claims as hysteria, but the evidence back at the cabin told me otherwise. "Get to the cabin and stay inside. Help is on the way." As they ran for cover, I positioned myself to face the direction they'd come from, scanning for any sign of the creature. Minutes passed like hours. The silence of the forest was heavy and unnatural. Then, without warning, it attacked. It came from the side, a blur of muscle and fangs, hitting me like a freight train. My rifle flew from my hands as I was thrown to the ground. I rolled, scrambling for my sidearm, but it was already on me. It was massive, humanoid, but covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was a grotesque mix of man and beast, with eyes that burned with a malevolent intelligence. Claws raked across my chest, pain flaring as I fought to keep it at bay. In the chaos, the hikers emerged from the cabin, one of them firing a flare gun they'd found inside. The flare hit the creature square in the face, and it recoiled with a roar, giving me the opening I needed. I grabbed my pistol and fired, emptying the magazine into its torso. It stumbled back, wounded but not dead. Inside. "Now," I shouted, and we all bolted for the cabin, slamming the door shut behind us. The creature pounded on the walls, its fury palpable. The hikers and I fortified the door as best we could, knowing it wouldn't hold forever. I managed to get a distress signal out on the radio, my voice shaky but clear. "Base, this is Gents. We've encountered a hostile creature. Repeat, hostile creature. We need immediate extraction. Over." The response was quick. "Hold tight, gents. Chopper en route. ETA 20 minutes. Over. 20 minutes. It felt like an eternity. The creature's assault on the cabin was relentless, each hit threatening to break through our makeshift barricade. The hikers were huddled together, their fear mirrored in my own thoughts. What the hell were we dealing with? Finally, the sound of rotor blades cut through the din, and the creature stopped its assault, retreating back into the forest. The helicopter landed in the clearing, and we wasted no time sprinting for the safety of the chopper. As we lifted off, I looked down at the cabin, now a speck amidst the vast wilderness. The Palmers' deaths would be investigated, explanations sought. But I knew one thing for certain: we weren't alone in those woods. Something was out there, something deadly and intelligent. The hikers and I were debriefed, our accounts taken seriously given the evidence at the scene. The official report would likely blame a bear or some other large predator, but those of us who were there knew the truth. The Adirondacks held secrets, and that day we had glimpsed one of its darkest. Once we were safely back at base, I sat in the infirmary, getting my wounds treated. The hikers were in a similar state, shaken but alive. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in, and I found myself pondering the reality of what we had faced. There was no room for sentimentality in my line of work, no space to dwell on the horrors that lurked in the shadows. The forest had always been a place of mystery and danger, and we were just visitors passing through. We'd survived this encounter, but I knew I'd be back out there soon, facing whatever challenges came my way. And so, with a bandaged chest and a wary eye on the horizon, I prepared for my next mission, knowing full well that the forest would never be the same.